I'm pleased to have with us once again Mr. Joe Corrao. Joe and I have worked together in the past on projects dealing with general aviation security, and his article this month zeroes in on the complicated and confusing airspace surrounding Washington, D.C. Joe is an accomplished pilot and a deep-thinking jurist who takes nothing for granted, and just as he has always done since I've known him, he not only presents the issue, but also provides a solution. Joe, welcome back.
Thank you, David, for that very kind and generous introduction.
Joe, in a nutshell, what made you decide to write about airspace security in the Washington, D.C. area?
Well, Dave, the unique airspace security requirements around the Washington, D.C. area have been a cause of concern for me and for many others since they were initially implemented back in, I believe it was February of 2003. You may recall that we started with what was then called an air defense identification zone around Washington, D.C., which, as far as domestic airspace is concerned, it's a unique structure. Air defense identification zone exists offshore around the United States and around other countries as well. And it's pretty well understood by folks who fly internationally on a routine basis. But interestingly, there is no ADAS between Canada and the United States, so the vast majority of international travelers in the United States, international flyers, pilots who cross national borders in the United States, do so between Canada and the United States, and they would never have had any experience with an ADAS until February of 2003. And of course, as we know from aviation safety research, consistency and standardization are the hallmarks of safety in aviation. And to have a unique animal like an ADAS with unique procedures and very high stakes for pilots and others associated with it, and unique symbology on charts, all of that uniqueness and complexity combines to make, in my view, the Washington area ADAS, subsequently transformed into a special flight rules area, sort of a path, a trap for the wary, even. In law, we have a sort of cliche. We refer to certain gotchas as traps for the unwary. But in my view, the Washington, D.C. Special Flight Rules area is a trap for the wary. Even folks who are really trying hard to comply can be misled by some of the vague procedures involved in the Washington Special Flight Rules area. It's made all the more of concern because it's unnecessary. When you look at the Special Flight Rules area and requirements, and you look at the characteristics of ordinary Class B, the overlap is tremendous. We could get rid of the special characteristics of the flight rules area by starting with ordinary Class B as our basis, tweaking it slightly in ways that would be relatively easy to comply with, and get exactly the same security benefit, if not better.
Joe, now you cite in your article some interesting and compelling numbers. How did you go about getting those numbers concerning airspace violations? And more importantly, what do you think they mean?
Well, yeah, the numbers are interesting. It's always good to have empirical support for your argument, and the FAA very kindly provided the bulk of that in a publication in August 2008. Back in August of 2008, FAA published a notice in the Federal Register called Special Awareness Training for Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Area. In that Federal Register publication, FAA gave us numbers, a large number of violations over about a 5-year period, and it worked out to about 1.68 violations per day throughout that entire 5-year period. Now, of course, the violation rate is very important. It's not the only number that there is, however. There's also FAA's prosecution number, its enforcement case number. That I obtained with a Freedom of Information Act request. So what we learned from those numbers is that during the two reference periods, during a 5-year period, FAA experienced about 1.68 violations per day of the Washington, D.C. ADAS. And during a portion of that time, during a one-year period inside of that time, they prosecuted about a violation every 2 days, roughly. So the difference may be accounted for by the fact that FAA may not have been able to find all the violators. You know, they observe violations on radar, but they don't always find who it was that, you know, bumped into the airspace. Occasionally they'll find somebody and they'll choose for one reason or another not to bring an enforcement action. So now what's really interesting, though, is that during that same period, when FAA brought, on average, an enforcement case every 2 days for violations of the ADAs, during that entire period they only brought 6 enforcement actions for violations of the Class B. Now what that says to me is that the compliance rate with standard Class B is much, much, much greater, about 25 times greater than the compliance rate with the Special Flight Rules area requirements, even though the airspace is almost exactly the same. I mean, you're in the same place. You're physically crossing those lines almost at the same time. And yet, 25 times more often are pilots able to comply correctly with the Class B requirements than they are with the ADAS requirement.
Joe, here's one last question for you. If we agree with what you presented and wanted to take action to get the airspace around Washington, D.C. changed, as you suggest, what do you recommend we do?
Well, official Washington seems to think of the Washington, D.C. area, Special Flight Rules area, as a local matter. And I think that's principally because they're not pilots for the most part. I think pilots recognize that the Washington, D.C. airspace is a national matter because pilots from all around the country can and do fly in this area. And in fact, it's an international matter because pilots from around the world can and do fly non-commercially. They can fly business aviation, they can fly general aviation for personal reasons in this area. So the fact that pilots from around the world, and certainly across the country, study and train and practice Class B procedures and are very familiar with the procedures required to safely and legally enter Class B airspace, that those pilots are suddenly confronted with this unique Special Flight Rules area around Washington, D.C. and unique procedures. We see in the empirical data the fact that the compliance rate with the Special Flight Rules area is not good. And we see by analyzing the elements of security that are present in the Special Flight Rules area, which is what my article is about, looking at those elements of security and comparing them to Class B, we find out that most of those elements are available in standard Class B, and the ones that are missing could easily be added to standard Class B without all the complexity of a Special Flight Rules area and all the special procedures that go along with it. So your question is, how can we move in the direction of more standardization and greater compliance in the Washington, D.C. area? And I would respectfully suggest that we can start by noting that this is in fact a national and an international concern, and we can ask our federal representatives across the country to take a look at this and to consider whether we're approaching this matter in the right way today. Whether might it not be better, and my argument, of course, is that it would be better, to standardize the procedures around Washington, D.C. by reverting to Class B, slightly modified, to achieve the elements of security that are available in the Special Flight Rules area through standard means using procedures that pilots are familiar with from around the country and around the world. If pilots who interact with Washington, D.C. airspace feel that that is in fact a laudable goal, something that we should strive for, then communicating that fact and explaining it to your congressmen and senators is probably a very good first step.
Well, Joe, I want to thank you once again for your article and especially for your insights.
Thank you, Dave, for this opportunity.